Welcome. My name is Jeffrey Mullen. I'm the acting chair of the Board of Appeals panel on the comprehensive permit application for 582 Blueville Avenue. Today is Wednesday, May 26th. This is our 17th hearing in this with respect to this application. With me are my fellow board members, Frank O'Brien and Giselle Joffer. So I want to welcome everybody tonight. Now, tonight we're scheduled to, is Mr. Reardon here?
Yep.
Okay. Oh, okay, Mr. Reardon, yep.
Evening.
Tonight we're scheduled here for Mr. Reardon. We've asked Mr. Schomer, the applicant's counsel, to respond to some questions and answers that came up before, and expect that potentially we'll get some supplemental information on the drainage and stormwater, but I'll leave that to Mr. Schomer. And Mr. Hill has asked to address the board, which we will do as has been our custom. We'll take questions and answers. Let me do some housekeeping before. Since we last met last Wednesday, we received a letter from Paul Gallagher dated yesterday. Mr. Gallagher owns, as people who follow this hearing know, owns the property at the bottom of Meeting House Hill Lane. And expressed a certain level of frustration with the status of the sewer, the condition of the sewer, the progress of the hearing, and asked questions about what was happening with the infrastructure that's in the street. And some of that is, since that letter's been received, some of that I know has been addressed by Mr. Schomer, and we've had a Q&A, which I think rolls up some of these issues. So we can address that, but I want to let people know that Mr. Gallagher's letter has been received and read and entered into the record on the website. We've also got a letter today from Mr. Dan Hill, counsel to the Vos Hill Neighborhood Association, in which he expressed some of his views and forwarded a letter from Mr. Horsley and Mr. Chesia, both of whom testified at the last hearing. So that's been entered into the record. I think both Mr. Chesia and Mr. Horsley indicated in their testimony that they would be submitting written testimony, which they have now done. And we've entered into that record, and that is available for the applicant to look at and, to the extent appropriate, respond to. We also received a letter from Mr. Schomer dated today in which he agreed to, on behalf of the applicant, to an extension on the last day to close the hearing, which is set by the regulation at 180 days from the date that it opened, which would have been, or where is currently June 8th. That would close the hearing on July 21st, and a companion extension for the decision to be due to the town clerk, which is 40 days from the close of the hearing by the reg, which would be August 30th. So to make that clearer for people, the applicant has proposed for the board's approval an extension of the last day to close the hearing from June 8th to 6 weeks to July 21st, and an extension of this date that the decision in this matter is due to the town clerk for 6 weeks from July 19th to August 30th. Now, that's consistent with what the applicant had said in the last hearing, and the board deferred a decision on that. Now we've received a letter reiterating that position. We also received an email from Mr. Schomer on May 24, which he responded to several questions that I had posed, mostly dealing with the meeting house, the meeting house sewer and the connection to the street, which is now available in the public record. Mr. Zawinski has filed that. And then we received a letter from Mr. Schomer dated May 24th, which responded to several questions that had been asked at the last hearing. Mr. Schomer had said he would do that, and he now has done that, with specific references to the questions that were asked and the answers that the applicant has provided. That's also available. Let me also say that today, Governor Baker filed legislation that would permit the conduct of the open meetings via virtually via Zoom or Microsoft Teams or whatever have you, through September 1st as a temporary measure while municipalities and others consider potential modifications to the open meeting laws. I mention that only because, as people may be aware, the governor's emergency is going to expire on June 15. And to the extent that the open meeting law is not modified by the Massachusetts legislature, these hearings will be conducted in person. So I don't want people to be surprised if in the middle of June, they get a notice that we'll be meeting at the Milton Senior Center, which is likely where we would need to do that. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. My own personal view is that these hearings have gone pretty well and, are time consuming, but are less time consuming for people in this forum. And I don't have evidence of this, but my guess is that we get more participation virtually with people being able to tune in. Others who do this as part of their regular business, like Ms. Barrett or Mr. Schumer, they may have better evidence. But in any event, I want people to be aware of that. So, so tonight we're going to hear from Mr. Reardon, Mr. Schumer, and Mr. Hill. And looking ahead, we still need to hear from Mr. Burke to completing the sewer and drainage work. I don't believe that's complete yet, although I'm going to rely on Mr. Reardon to hear from that. We also want to hear from the peer reviewer on the design, and that's not yet been scheduled. And we want to hear from the town officials on the modifications, that is both the urban design modifications and the revised stormwater and drainage. So we need to reserve time to do that. So that's kind of the totality. And then of course we'll deliberate the matter. So with that, I don't know whether the board wants to consider, before we hear from anybody, board wants to consider whether or not to accept the applicant's extension of the 6 weeks. I will say, with due appreciation for the feet to the fire comment, which, I don't think this particular board needs feet to the fire given the way that this hearing has gone on. I put another way, I hope that nobody believes that we have in any way delayed the proceedings of this, which I think is the intent of the 180 days. That said, my own personal view is it's going to take longer to close this hearing than 6 weeks, but I really don't want to take a lot of people's time to debate how much longer. And to put this matter behind us, I would accept the 6 week extension, and I would reserve the right to consider that to the extent that we need more time. But I'd also like to hear from the members on that. Mr.
Good
O'Brien.
evening.
Oh, Ms. Joffer.
Oh, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chair. I mean, I agree. I think we accept the extension for now with the view that it's not realistic.
Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of comments. I take exception to any implication from any of the parties that this board is by any means being dilatory or not moving forward with as much dispatch as possible. I also appreciate the time that everyone has spent on this. I want to know, I understand that people realize that for the board and other folks who are interested in this, it takes a lot out of our day. And for me, I have certain professional obligations, some of which I've had to move or defer in order to be on this board. So I do take those assertions somewhat personally. Having said that, for the sake of moving the record forward, moving this hearing forward, I'm prepared to accept the extension, but I wanted noted that like Ms. Joffrey, and I believe like the chair, I do not think that that is a sufficient amount of time for the hearing to be extended, given the issues that remain outstanding. And frankly, the lives of the board and others. I don't know about other folks, but I'm planning to take some vacation in the summer and not spending my time on Board of Appeals hearings. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I return the hearing to you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien.
Jeff, you put yourself on mute.
Thank you, Mr. O'Brien. Mr. Schomer, can you confirm that your letter and what the board just agreed to are consistent, that we're going to extend the 180-day deadline to July 21st?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that's consistent
And
with our intent.
And the 40 days will be thereafter will then be August 30?
That's correct.
Okay, so we'll let the record reflect that. I'll make a note to the schedule that will be published. We'll put it out as soon as possible. So I don't know if people are following that, but I do try to keep that updated regularly. So the decision will be due to the town clerk August 30. Now, so that's point one. Point two is I asked, before we get to the substance, I asked a series of questions which Mr. Schomer was kind enough to reply to. Thank you. I have a follow-up question for you, Mr. Schomer, and that is this easement that goes out to the street. I'm wondering if you could respond to the lack of documentation of that and how that intersects with the requirement to have evidence of site control as per the reg.
So I would say, Mr. Chair, at the moment, we're still trying to track down documentation of that. That's been more challenging than it typically would, I think, due to the COVID disruptions to business at Town Hall. I suspect that there may be some information regarding the easement in the documentation surrounding the subdivision and its layout. But that research is still ongoing. That having been said, I have done a fair amount of research myself at the Registry of Deeds and have not yet come upon that information. With respect to easement rights, whether or not we do locate a formal written easement, the position of the applicant is that we do have easement rights in that easement as shown on the plan. Whether that's by prescription or by estoppel principles, and if necessary, we would need to go to the land court to have a confirmation of that. And barring all this, our intent would be to have a private conversation with the landowner regarding that easement, and that would go without saying. In any case, because we'll be doing work in and around their property, and we'd want to have a conversation with their preference for where exactly those lines are located. So I would say that this issue, it's certainly on our radar. We're looking into it, and we're dedicated to come up with as close as we can to a final answer for the board while this hearing is still pending.
All right. Okay, thank you. That's consistent with the letter that you wrote or the email that you wrote. Appreciate that. Let me update the members of the listeners to this hearing. So I wrote a note reminding or referring to the applicant back to what really started with notes that appeared in the town's comments where they wanted evidence of the easement that runs from the property to Meeting House Hill Lane to be submitted. That we did get a plan, but we didn't get the easement itself. And Ms. McGrath followed that up with a request, and then I followed that up and I asked for see whether or not that has been received, partly because I wanted Mr. Reardon to have that as part of his peer review in response to the town's original comment, but partly because I wanted to understand exactly what the easement was for. You know, first of all, whether it exists, what it was for, and whether the use that the applicant was putting to it is consistent with the scope of the easement. So in the meantime, one of the things that it looks like it happens is the actual line is not within the easement, the purported easement on the plan. So there's a little issue there as well that needs to get cleaned up. So the reason I ask is site control, including easements, is a basic eligibility requirement under the regulation at 260 CMR 5604 paren 4 paren G. So I think that, obviously the easement it's a small easement, but as applied to the facts of this matter and the amount of time that this hearing has spent and the people in this hearing have spent about stormwater and sewerage discharge, it seems to me critically important that we nail this issue down during the hearing, which is why I want to raise it with you, Mr. Schumer, now, while the hearing is still going, and not surprise you not that I would want to surprise you, but I want to keep this going and let you know that that's a concern of at least me. I just feel like we need to run that down to the ground, and we need more evidence and more documentation about it, particularly because of the requirement that you have to have site control in order to build this project. And I don't see that as something that the board could, for example, make conditional. It's basic. So at least that's how I understand the program to work. So I'm just putting that out there. I'm happy to hear from the members, but having not spoken to the members about it, I don't know if you're prepared to say anything about it, but I did want to get that out on the table. And, for anybody who wants to see this email exchange, it's been entered into the record. So, it's available for public inspection at people's convenience. Do the members want to be heard on this, or do we understand? Mr. O'Brien.
Mr. Chairman, I agree with you. It's a critical importance. Site control is a basic requirement, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to produce a resolution one way or the other on this. I do know Attorney Schumer's recitation of the possible alternatives that the applicant may move forward, but that's a little bit of putting the cart before the horse. I think we have to, as you said, run the easement issue to ground here.
Okay, thank you. Giselle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think for me, it just seems a little backwards and fundamental and primary. And so I don't know, is there an easement or is there not? And if this is the type of thing that ends up in litigation, like why are, we have a 6-week extension, but it seems like that's the least of our concerns. I don't know. I think it should be resolved quickly.
Okay, so fair enough. Let's just, we can appreciate that, but both Ms. Joffer and Mr. O'Brien. Mr. Schumer, you know the issue. You've written on it. You understand what we're saying. You've heard the board, and we'll continue this, and we'll hear from you again on the subject. Is that a fair way to resolve it or move on for now?
I think it is, Mr. Chair. We're very much aware of this. We understand the issue. I agree it's an important one. We have found a significant amount of evidence that it exists in various sources. For example, it's noted in the town's taking plan for Meeting House Lane, which may mean that the town has an easement in this location as well. It's also noted on the town's tax maps. But as I said, research into this is ongoing, and rest assured, it's not slipped off our radar.
Okay. I'm just checking my power here. I'm about to run out of battery. I'm not sure why. Go ahead, Giselle.
Yeah, one more thing, Mr. Chair. And who's the property owner?
The downhill property owner?
Yes.
Off the top of my head, Ms. Joffer, I don't know their name, but I could look it up while we're on and update you later in the hearing. Okay,
that's fine. So I guess sort of my second question, and it sounds like you haven't then yet reached out to them.
Not yet, no.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'd appreciate it if you could let me know.
Certainly.
Okay. I hope I don't run out of batteries. All right. Last issue before we move on. You, Mr. Schumer, have asked for the board to impose a condition about a construction management plan in the application. I'm not liking that condition. And again, I haven't consulted with my board members, but it feels to me like the weight of the evidence that we've been hearing is that we need some evidence that this project as designed, particularly given the extensive time that people have spent on the design, is constructible within the limits of the property and not subject to any other unknown impacts. I'm not suggesting that we need the kind of detailed construction management plan that you would have post-bidding, but I don't think that at least this application is conducive to that type of thing. Now, I'm not suggesting that you have to agree to that, but again, in the spirit of giving you time to prepare that, I want you to know that that's at least how I feel. And consistent with the last comment, I'll ask the members of the board whether or not they want to be heard on it. I do believe, just for the record, that we need some level of a construction management plan here. Mr. O'Brien.
I agree, Mr. Chairman. I agree with your position.
Ms. Joffer.
I'm also in agreement.
Okay. All right. So the board's agreeing tonight. Mr. Showman, I don't expect you to, I mean, I'm not asking for you to make a comment on that, but I did want to know, and we're happy to debate this either now or at another time. We could also put that off until we hear from the final of the peer reviewers and the balance of Mr. Burke's testimony, in which I have an interest. So, but you know, your pleasure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just by way of brief response to what the members have said, and this is not responsive or intended to be responsive to your concerns regarding constructability. We recognize and understand that the board members has concerns about that. With respect to filing a construction management plan now, we're still discussing that with our team to assess whether that's feasible. In my experience doing Chapter 40B permitting, it's not typically done. I can't remember an instance in which it was done. And I had a brief opportunity to peruse Attorney Hill's letter this afternoon when he filed it. And he made some comments about filing a construction management plan as well in his letter. And so it spurred my curiosity to investigate whether there is any Housing Appeals Committee case law. And there actually is a case that was issued just in March by the Housing Appeals Committee, where they specifically held that construction management plans cannot be required during the permitting process, and that conditions upon those construction management plans, even if they're voluntarily filed, cannot exceed the requirements that are imposed on non-subsidized housing. So I'm happy to provide that case to the board. But with that having been said, we're considering the issue to determine whether we can voluntarily provide something that would satisfy the board in terms of the plan for construction management.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, please do that, Mr. Schomer. Thank you. Okay, Mr. Reardon.
Mr. Mullen, one quick question for
Mr. O'Brien.
One quick question for the applicant. Since it's such a recent case, Mr. Schomer, was that decision appealed, or is an appeal pending anywhere?
That I don't know the answer to that, Mr. O'Brien. I can find that case and submit it to the board. The general principle behind it, I think, is a fairly simple one, in that it's the principle behind it is that the intent of the 40B filing process is that the plans be preliminary, and construction management plans are very far down the road in terms of the level of detail. So that was the general principle. But I'm happy to provide that and any information I can find about whether it's under appeal.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, may I ask a question?
Ms. Barrett.
Mr. Schomer, was that the Wellesley decision?
Ms. Barrett, I don't know the name of the case off the top of my head. I could let you know later in the hearing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that hasn't been my experience. Just well, projects I've worked on need a construction management plan up front to prove the constructability of the base design. To me, it's a level of detail that we're talking about. I just
Chairman,
think
if I could,
this is a tricky project. Oh, Mr. Reardon, yes.
just one point on the construction management plan. It's not exclusively a constructability issue. It's whether or not the facility can be constructed safely. So a fundamental position of the responsibility of your board is to determine whether the project can be done safely. And if there are certain obvious construction realities that are difficult to achieve and not obviously can be done safely, it stands to reason that having the applicant lay out how they're going to do something safely, largely the complications come in because of the allowed density, right? So when you have these allowances that allow you to push to the outer limits of the project, they're creating these stresses at the boundary that inevitably could end up with an unsafe construction environment. So to me, the construction management plan is largely about communicating how the work can be done safely so that the board can proceed with confidence that what they're approving, if you are approving it, can be constructed safely.
Thank you, Mr. Reardon. Okay, why don't we move to the Mr. Schomer, you prepared to move on?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay, all right. Where we move on to the substance of the hearing, which is we want to hear from Mr. Reardon. We'll then send it to Mr. Schomer and Mr. Hill, just for you to be prepared. Mr. Reardon, I wonder if you could provide to us your impressions of the status of, first of all, provide us with the status of the stormwater and drainage design, your impressions of it, and any other commentary you wish to share.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick recap, just to avoid any confusion. We last issued a letter on April 13th, which was issued after the last big change, which was when they figured out a way to save the existing home and the gardens. In May, a few weeks ago, May 13th, we got a revised submittal that addressed a lot of the comments that we had made previously. But the applicant gave us a response to our February letter. So what we want to make sure is that as part of our, that at some point we get a response to our April letter, not the February letter. So after the applicant sort of went through their changes last week, we had an opportunity to talk with their engineer, Jim Burke, and work through our thoughts and some comments we had on the stormwater model. I think we found some common ground. My expectation was that there were some changes forthcoming. We haven't seen much yet, but we anticipate them soon. As far as the last submittal, the first thing to say is an absolutely significant improvement in both the quality, the content, and the design decisions that are reflected in that submittal. I think it goes a long way towards demonstrating that a project complying with the stormwater management standards can be done. I think we're close, but we're not there. So a lot of what we've talked about with Jim is how do we sort of put the last nail in that coffin in terms of demonstrating clearly that it can meet the standard without requiring significant changes to the actual plan. Another big important part of kind of our takeaway was the project has constricted a little bit, so it's become more centered on the site and provided a little bit of breathing room along the outside perimeter, on average about, say, 6 to 10 feet, which might not sound like much, but it when we were faced with just only having, in some cases, less than 2 feet, an additional 6 or 10 feet does make a lot of difference in terms of just giving us some understanding that there's some capacity for movement that can address problems if they come up. I think the biggest change that helped that sort of perimeter get drawn back towards the site was, I don't know if you recall, but they had parallel parking around the outside of the drive aisle, which in our opinion created a real awkward parking arrangement where people would be backing out of a stall, heading right towards the door of a car parked opposite parallel. We asked them as part of our other comments to remove those stalls. All those stalls are now gone. So all we have is one single line of 90-degree stalls off the inside of the aisle, which is good too, because typically people pull straight in. So that means headlights would be shining into the project, not out from the project. More typically, if someone backs into the stall, you're going to have that, but typically people will pull straight in and back out. The stormwater system, fundamental improvements on that. Most notably, they've sort of distributed the improvements across the site rather than try to consolidate them in one location. Distribution of the elements across the site to match the natural features and the demands across the site is an LID technique. So I think that's a good thing. They've also added that that open air pond, which is a recommendation of ours, principally because it's the most efficient way to get good stormwater treatment. It's the most efficient way to get mitigation of peak flows. And it's really the most tried and true and most reliable means of doing so. So in our opinion, that's a very appropriate use of that space in a net benefit. In general, site circulation we think is a little bit improved, but no reason to think that that's going to be a problem going forward. Where we stand right now is we're expecting some changes from Mr. Burke, and specifically some changes to the model. It's probably going to result in some movement of some particular pieces of the stormwater system, but I wouldn't expect it to be a fundamental shift. They're also going to need to address the fact that some of their proposed recharge systems don't comply with offset requirements to foundations. So I think there are solutions out there. It's based on my conversations with Jim. I think he understands the issues at hand, and I would imagine he's going to have a solution sometime soon. Then we'd ask, as I mentioned before, that they address all the comments in our April 13th letter. And the reason why it's important is we actually sort of rescinded our original letter because the project had changed so much that we just started from scratch. So in commenting or in responding to our February letter, it's kind of commenting on or responding to comments that no longer apply. So we really want to get responses to our April letter. And then we are still looking for, last week we talked about the need for some capacity information. There was discussion about how much stress you're putting on that stream that runs along the side of the property next to Delphi Academy. Some questions about how much stress they're putting on the downstream infrastructure. Jim and I spoke about the kind of analysis they could do that could demonstrate, why the project wouldn't be a net negative on those systems. And we imagine he's going to be coming up with that shortly. To reiterate, I think the construction management plan is absolutely critical. There has to be some vetting or some common understanding as to how things are going to get done, just so that everybody has similar expectations. And then that if any of those descriptions create questions or create issues that people are going to want to be heard. For example, if their plan is to let their construction people park on Meeting House Lane, well, I'm sure there are people that are going to not want to see that. If their plan involves shutting down a lane of Blue Hill Avenue, I think we need to know about that. So if their plan revolves around having offsite mobilization for parking for their contractors, then you should know about that so you can condition your decision accordingly. And then the last thing I think, and it was hit on a little bit by at the last meeting and in some of the subsequent comment letters from the abutters, is a discussion about how the project is going to handle groundwater. I don't necessarily see it as a huge issue, but I think it's something that needs to be clarified as to what their strategy is going to be, so that if there are concerns relative to the particular strategy that they're going to employ, that the public and we have an opportunity to comment on that. Principal thing being is, as I think Scott Horsley mentioned and John Cheshire mentioned, that the parking garage is going to be partly in groundwater. They have two choices. They can build a foundation system in the hopes that it keeps groundwater out, which in our experience, groundwater always finds a way of getting in, or they're going to have a dewatering system in perpetuity that keeps the foundation dry, so that basically makes a hole in the groundwater table, for lack of a better word. But in either case, we'd like to know that they have a strategy for that, and we'd like to know what their strategy is so we can comment accordingly. And I think that's where we are right now. And again, the CMP for us is a very, very critical component, and we request it on every review we do, just because it's usually the thing that most people are surprised by, that when construction happens, that they see things that they didn't expect. It's pretty easy for people to visualize what a building looks like when you show it a picture of the building, but very few people understand what the true impacts of construction will be until they're right there.
Thank you, Mr. Reardon. Mr. O'Brien, questions?
A couple of questions, and thank you, Mr. Reardon. I appreciate your being here this evening, and I appreciate the time and effort, and as well as the time and effort that Mr. Burke has put into this issue as well. I'm a little frustrated in how long it's taking. Just maybe as an amateur and not being completely conversant, at least until this hearing, not conversant with drainage issues, but learning more every day. So to be blunt, what's taking so long?
So these are issues that, you know, there can be disagreements on how people would approach them. I think it's just that it hadn't been thought through initially. I think we're in a much better place now. In fairness to Jim, I see a lot worse. I do see better, but I see a lot worse. So, you know, I don't know why it ended up where it was. I know there are a lot of stresses on engineers, from architects, from developers, but yeah, I would have hoped the submittal we got last time was the first submittal we got, but it is what it is.
Thank you. I guess that was more of a comment than a question. So here's a real question. If we were to take some of the comments made by some of the applicants, some of the neighbors, experts that were provided to the board orally last week and in written form this week, it's almost like if they dig at this site, it's going to be like the Beverly Hillbillies, except the bubbling crude is going to be groundwater spurting up. Did I hear you correctly that you don't feel that the groundwater issue is as big of an issue as some of the other experts we've heard comments from?
I think that's a fair statement. I think perhaps what I heard last week was a bit hyperbolic, but yeah, I don't think there's anything terribly unique about this site. I think it's going to be incumbent upon Jim to provide a little bit more detail to put sort of the scope of those issues in context. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was anything inaccurate about what was said. I think they're all truths. Whether or not those issues are substantive enough I think is the biggest question. I think we've got to remember one key thing, that the project isn't going to make it rain any more than it currently does. The only thing the project's going to do is allow water to run off the site faster than it does. And that's why we have very, very specific stormwater management standards, are to address many of the issues that were brought up by Mr. Chesia and Mr. Horsley. I typically use those stormwater standards, which deals with recharge, infiltration, stormwater runoff, all of those things as the measuring stick for what is significant and what isn't. So my attitude generally is that if you comply with the stormwater standards, you have demonstrated adequately that your project is not going to create a significant impact.
Thank you, Mr. Reardon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jeff, you put yourself on mute again.
Ms. Jaffer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Reardon, you mentioned at the beginning that you're expecting some updates or adjustments from Mr. Burke and his team. Could you speak a little bit to that, sort of the remaining concerns that you do have, or maybe improvements that you discussed with Mr. Burke?
Yep. So in the way I mentioned those, the stormwater standards, and the biggest challenge for developments like this is to make sure that you're not letting water run off your site any faster than it did originally, because that's what creates downstream impacts, creates flooding downstream, because you get more water trying to get downstream faster than it did before. So all of these things that you see, Jim, scattered all over the site, they're mostly there for the reason of holding water on site so that you don't let it off any faster than it currently does. In order to demonstrate that those things are all properly sized, you develop these stormwater models. They're iterative models that are industry standards. There are rules in the standards for how those models get constructed and how those variables are filled. There are some changes there are some things that Jim did that don't comply with the standards that we want fixed. It'll probably end up in a slightly larger system, but I don't think it's going to make it overwhelmingly larger that it would necessarily impact the development itself. Beyond that, there are requirements for offsets for foundations for infiltration systems. Mr. Chessier brought that up. I agree with that. Again, there are other places on site that Jim can utilize that comply with those setbacks. So those are the issues we'd like to see. The site is still tight. So before if this were a site that had plenty of extra space, we'd say, no problem, these changes easy to accommodate. But because we don't have a lot of open space to expand into, I think these things need to be fixed before I can confidently say that that there is a solution to the stormwater system.
Thank you. That's helpful. Nothing further from me, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. So when do you expect, and I know Mr. Burke is here and we're talking about him as if it's in the third person, and I could ask him this question, but you've got the floor. So I'm going to ask you, when do you expect to receive the final information from the applicant?
That was for me, Chair?
Yes, Mr. Reardon.
I had thought I would have seen something prior to today, but I know we're all real busy, and I'd rather it be correct than fast.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. Okay. So let me just say, and this is a bit of a rhetorical question. When the applicant has an opportunity to speak, we're going to be looking for that final report, and then Mr. Reardon, we're going to be looking for something in writing from you. And to the extent that you can, I'd like you to address specifically some of the issues that were raised in Mr. Chessier and Mr. Horsley's letters that we received today and that we heard from before, which I know you've addressed here. I'm particularly interested in the federal compliance with the federal law and the intersection with the Wetlands Protection Act and the jurisdiction of the Milton Conservation Commission, and how you would best advise us to coordinate that particular activity with respect to this application. So you could either speak to that now or have that appear in your recommendation, but I'm interested in the coordination of that particular activity, given the importance of the stormwater and drainage issues to the site.
Yeah, I'd very much like to, I'll address those in written form, but at least for tonight, one of the most recent changes is now, there's a lot of the recent changes have now brought in these different questions. Originally, there wasn't work in the 100-foot buffer zone, so we didn't have wetlands jurisdiction. Now we do. I don't think that changes too much because the same Massachusetts stormwater standards that we're reviewing the project against are what applies for Concom jurisdiction. Now that they are connecting directly to the drainage system, which is part of an MS4, they have compliance obligations with the MS4. I would say we need to keep in mind the MS4 permit, which is a permit that the town has for its discharges from its stormwater system to waters of the United States, is the town's permit. That is not the applicant's permit. They don't comply with the town's permit. They comply with the programs that the town develops under their permit. So as long as they demonstrate compliance with the requirements of the town's stormwater bylaw, then by extension, they are complying with the MS4 permit. So I'll speak to that in more detail, but in fairness to the abutters consultants, they are correct that all those standards do apply. I don't think they're sort of game breakers or anything like that. I think they're, if anything, they're just consistent with what we've already done.
Okay, thank you. You spoke about an open air pond. I don't think I heard it that way the last time. And specifically, I thought that I heard that it was not expected to be regular standing water. So I didn't consider that to be a pond. Now maybe that's a technical term that you're using, but for the laity, what is this thing? Is it actually a pond? Will it be wet? Does it need to be secure? There's safety concerns.
Pond is a very specific vernacular for engineers. So in our models, we refer to them as ponds. So it's kind of a ubiquitous term. There are very strict requirements in design standards in the stormwater standards for how you design multiple types of ponds. One of the requirements that they have is that they drain within 72 hours of a storm. So part of the analysis that the applicant engineer has to do is provide a calculation that shows how the pond drains within 72 hours of a storm event. So to the question you had, it is not intended to hold water all the time. It is in fact designed to hold a specific amount of water and to make sure that it doesn't last any longer than 72 hours.
Okay, all right. Thank you. I don't have any further questions. Let me ask the applicant, Mr. Schomer, do you have questions of the peer reviewer, Mr. Reardon?
I don't myself, Mr. Chair. Perhaps Jim Burke does, or perhaps he can respond to some of the things Mr. Reardon said. And thank you, Mr. Reardon, for your input tonight. Very helpful. And Jim, perhaps you could also update the board with what you've been doing this week with respect to testing the municipal infrastructure.
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Mr. Reardon, thanks for your review. It's pretty much consistent with what we talked about last week. I expect to have everything kind of buttoned up by the end of the day tomorrow and pull everything together on Friday. And I should have answers to all your questions and concerns. As far as, what I have been really working on, and I hope to, button up tomorrow, is the capacity issues with regards to the intermittent stream as well as the infrastructure for Meeting House Lane. And I should have that completed probably early tomorrow morning. And then it's just a matter of how to put the information together in a coherent manner. The infrastructure, as you well know, everybody, the abutters and everybody else, it's undersized. What we're going to be proving to the board and to the abutters and to Mr. Reardon is that this project is not going to have a negative impact on the infrastructure whatsoever. And I look forward to talking to you guys about that once it's submitted and should be done and submitted on Friday.
Mr. Burke, one thing that I thought was helpful with Mr. Schomer's submittal is the plans for the infrastructure on Meeting House Lane, specifically in response to testing that line and responding to the concerns that Mr. Gallagher has had. I wonder if you can speak to what you're planning to do there.
Well, I got out there myself yesterday. I popped about a dozen manholes. Haven't done that in years, and I stuck my head down in all the drain manholes and all the sewer manholes. And what I've found is that that the infrastructure itself is in good shape, certainly undersized. The sewer itself is fine. I can't find, and I should reach out to Mr. Gallagher specifically and ask him if he has some engineering plans that show his improvement. I have a sewer card from the DPW that shows his connection that runs in front of his house toward the manhole that connects to the MWRA line. So the lowest manhole in the system in this neighborhood. The sketch doesn't provide any sort of vertical information, in a sense that I don't know where that connection is vertically connected to the pipe. I'm hoping it's connected to the main on Meeting House Lane, which would make the most sense just from the direction it's coming from. The way he's got the sewer running right now, and it looks like a contractor prepared it. I don't know if there are engineering drawings for it or not. DPW didn't seem to have access to that. But maybe Mr. Gallagher does when it was being constructed. But it basically, the way he has the source service designed or constructed, it makes a U-turn. It comes, flows towards Meeting House Lane, takes a U-turn and then connects into the main that connects to the MWRA. Now that seems to be working. Maybe the original service was connected to the Alfred Lane line that is really flat and has low flow attached to it, and could have been impacted for a clog or something like that. I don't know. I have to talk to Mr. Gallagher to figure that out. But if what I think is true, I think and they made the connection with the U-turn. I think it's the system itself. It has the capacity to handle the addition, and Mr. Gallagher really wouldn't have a concern with regards to the additional sewage coming down Meeting House Lane.
Okay, well, please do that. I feel like we've got a written response from the applicant on what's going to be done, and I think it would be helpful at some point in a future hearing to just get an off-site infrastructure report.
I'll gladly.
The concerns that were raised, the work that was done, and the results. I feel like that's as important as the on-site stuff, with given the amount of things that have been raised here. Yes, Mr. Burke.
I'll gladly knock on his door and discuss it with him, sometime tomorrow if he's available. But I was out there, like I said, I was out there yesterday, and I'll certainly make myself available to solve this issue.
Very good. Thank you. Mr. Reardon.
I just have a question through the chair for Mr. Burke. So Jim, did you do any research to see if the town has any records of SSO sanitary sewer overflows down on Alfred Street?
I have all their record plans, plan and profiles for the sewer systems, and they're not showing.
What I'm referring to is if there's a situation where the sanitary sewer system has overflowed to the surface, the town would have an obligation to report that.
Yeah, no, we've looked into that, and Mr. Berkeley said that there hasn't been any information on there. That was discussed at the site walk in the spring. Okay,
if you could just report on what you found or what you didn't find on that sure. Would be helpful, because in our history is the first way to demonstrate that there is a problem with the sanitary sewer system is that there is a history of overflows.
Agreed.
So if there's no history of overflows, then that's important information for the board to have. If there is a history of overflows, then we need to know some details about it.
The history is the situation that caused the Gallagher family a lot of strife, and they invested a decent amount of money to solve it, and I think they have. So that's all the source system overflow information that I have for that area.
What I'm asking you to do is check with the town to see if they have a record of any sanitary sewer overflows in that area. If they have some, get a copy of the reports. If they don't have any, report back to the board that, what your findings were for the last 10 years, the last 15 years, there hasn't been a reported overflow.
Very good.
No, I don't think if an individual home had a problem, that would constitute a sanitary sewer overflow for the town. But if we have a manhole that sewer comes out of, or there's some record of it, that would be a suggestion that we have an issue downstream.
Understood.
Thanks.
Mr. Schomer, any other questions?
I don't believe so, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Hill? Questions of Mr. Reardon?
No, I don't have any questions at this time.
Okay. Okay. Mr. Schomer, do you have any, thank you, Mr. Reardon. Mr. Schomer, do you have anything else you'd like to add at this point to supplement your oral testimony tonight, your written testimony in the last week that you want to share with the board?
No, Mr. Chair, I would say only that I did see that Mr. Gallagher's letter was posted this morning. I have read it. We will be responding to that because we're aware that he has some concerns down there. He's at the primary location where some issues have been happening, both with respect to sewer and and drainage. So we're looking into those and we will respond as soon as possible. What I would suggest at this point, Mr. Chair, is a working session, again, between Mr. Reardon and Mr. Burke, and perhaps if Judy Barrett is available, one of the board members, whoever else from the town who you think would be appropriate, the board members. But I find that those kind of sessions can be very helpful to work through these kind of very technical issues which are lingering, and I sense the board's frustration that these issues are continuing to linger, and I share them, and I do want to get past them as much as the board members do, and so does Jim, and so does Sean, I'm sure. So that would be my suggestion, is that we set up a Zoom call where we all get online, go through the issues, and figure out how we're going to solve them.
Let me just say, I don't know about the frustration, but one of the issues with these offsite infrastructure points is I feel like it's a moving, it's a moving goal. And we've heard, maybe because of the modifications to the design, I don't know, but one of the reasons I asked the question the way I did is I wanted to have, at least with respect to the current plan, what current plans that have been submitted to the board with the application, what the offsite infrastructure proposal is, what's going to be tested, what we're going to understand, and the information that's going to be available to the board when it considers the merits of the application. I feel like that's critically important given the amount of time that the neighbors have spent, and you know, frankly, some of the offsite issues. Now, maybe those can all be addressed, and maybe there's a good plan in place, but I just don't feel like we've got that nailed down yet. So I appreciate you working on that. In terms of the working session, I have no objection. Ms. Barrett, I wonder if you have a comment on that, and if that's something that you might be able to schedule.
Mr. Chair, if you would like a work session to be arranged, I'd be happy to do that.
I want you to work with the appropriate parties. I'd like Mr. Zawinski to be available.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And likely Mr. Berkeley. So, you know, whatever the usual and customary process is on that, and then perhaps that group can report back to the board on the progress made on the technical details. I think that's what Mr. Schomer is suggesting.
That's fine. Certainly.
Exactly right.
Okay. Mr. Schomer, anything else?
Nothing from us. Thank you very much.
Mr. Hill?
Nothing from us, and we would love the opportunity to sit in on a work session meeting, maybe one representative from the neighborhood group, if that's possible too.
Ms. Barrett, is that customary?
I've seen it done. I've seen it not done. I think it's up to the board.
You know, my sense is, given the amount of time that the neighborhood group has put into this, I think it would be helpful. And I'd invite Mr. Hill to make a recommendation for somebody to sit on that. Let me put it another way. I'd hate for the working session to be done only to have the neighborhood group come back and object to the work of the working session. I feel like that's maybe counterproductive. So that's my sense. Members have a different view?
No, I agree with your suggestion, Mr. Chair.
Giselle?
Yes, I think that makes sense.
The only thing, Mr. Hill, it's got to be a small group. You know, you got to have one, you know?
I agree. Yep.
Everyone gets one.
Yep.
Except we get two. We get Reardon and O'Brien.
Mr. Chair, may I share my thoughts on this question?
Mr. Schomer.
I don't per se have an objection to Attorney Hill's someone from his group attending the working session. I think transparency is a good thing in and of itself. My only concern is that the purpose of these kind of working groups, I think, for them to be productive, there needs to be an understanding and an assumption going into it that you're there to work through problems and find solutions. And what I've seen to date from Mr. Chesia and Mr. Horsley, as much as we respect their opinion, as I mentioned last week, there hasn't been much in the way of solutions to these problems. It's been more motivated from the perspective of, we think that the applicant should not be permitted to build what they're proposing to build. So that's my only concern. We welcome their input into this, and we welcome perhaps one of Mr. Hill's clients to sit in on the session, but with the understanding that it's the purpose of it is to work through and find engineering solutions.
Yeah, I think the qualifications of Mr. Chessier and Mr. Horsley speak for themselves. And given the choice of having a less than transparent meeting where Mr. Chessier and Mr. Horsley will simply be forced to comment on the conclusions of that hearing, or having one of them or their delegate as selected by Mr. Hill to be there, I'm going to choose the latter. It's more transparent. It's more consistent with this hearing. It's more consistent with the time that people have put into that. And another way to explain the objections is simply the moving target that has been this design. So I hear you, Mr. Schomer. I'm going to rely on Mr. Hill and his experience in these matters to advise his clients accordingly, and we'll jointly engage in that process in the spirit in which it's offered. I mean, all of that is subject to coming back and having it discussed in an open session of this board. I just don't want to have the session be all about excluding people who've been a participant in this process. That's I think that's the sense of the board. So respectfully, I hear your concern, and I'm going to rely on Mr. Hill to address that. Mr. Hill, is that fair?
Absolutely.
Okay. Did you want to be heard tonight? You wrote us a long letter asking to be heard, but do you have offering any testimony tonight, Mr. Hill?
I would, Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me, we do have Mr. Chestia and Mr. Horsley here tonight. If you recall, at the last meeting, they only had a day or two to review the plans. So they've now had a week. They have some specific comments. Mr. Chestia has some technical comments on the stormwater design, and Mr. Horsley would like to speak more broadly on the overall site hydrology issues that this project presents. And then after they speak, if you'd indulge me for 5 or 10 minutes, I'd like to just explain the ramifications of the tie-in to the Meeting House Lane system and how that draws into the MS4 general permit. This is a federal law requirement. I appreciate Mr. Reardon's recitation of the legal principles. Sometimes I get accused of practicing engineering, and Mr. Reardon might be wading a little bit into the legal field tonight, but that's okay. But there are some federal legal implications here that actually are quite relevant, especially as we talk about construction management planning. The case that Mr. Schomer was referring to about 20 minutes ago was a case out of Wellesley. It's an HAC decision that was issued in March. But the distinction is that in this case, we have a federal law that requires essentially a construction management process, and Chapter 40B does not trump federal law, as you all know. So this isn't the Wellesley case. This is actually quite different. But I would like, Mr. Chairman, if we could have Mr. Chestia introduce his comments, and then Mr. Horsley introduce his, and then if I can circle back on the bigger picture issues.
Fair enough. Let me just remind Mr. Chestia, the folks to offer testimony, that it'd be helpful to try not to repeat what we've heard. We appreciate the prior testimony. We've received your letters. We thank you for that. Just in the interest of time, Mr. Chestia. Welcome back.
Thank you. Some of these, I mean, I'm going to run through a couple of things. I'll try to be brief, but I just want to raise sort of my points here relative to the groundwater to start. It's not just a long-term issue. This is a large building. There would be a considerable amount of groundwater collected. It's not like a house where you put maybe half the foundation. You know, if you put a drain around the foundation, it's typically not going to be 12 feet below the water table at the highest point. You tend to fill a little bit, and you might have a little bit of water around it. This is a pretty significant size building, a pretty significant size excavation, and the amount of water that'll have to be pumped out of this excavation to build it is a significant issue. And where that's going to go, when really the only place is probably Meeting House Lane, is a significant issue. So that wraps into your construction management plan a bit, but I think that an assessment of the quantity of the flow should also be part of that assessment, as it will affect offsite capacity if you have groundwater flowing into a pipe in Meeting House Lane for essentially months at a time. You're taking up capacity. So that should be part of the assessment. I just want to make that point. I won't go into detail. We did talk about construction management plans. I think that's critical, in particular for the groundwater management, but not just that. Most of the area of the site that remains open is protected. The front yard has the trees. You're not supposed to be in there, so there's no real space to work. So you're not working in the historic garden. So there's not much place to put things. And I think it's critical, as Sean said, from a safety point of view, but safety involves storage of materials and things like that as well, because this is a big building, a lot of materials coming in and a lot of earthwork. 13, 15-foot cut for that west side of the building, that's a significant amount of earth to move. A lot of trucks and a lot of earthwork. Offsite impacts we've talked about. I want to just say one thing on the drainage wise. So we always look at the rate of runoff from a site. You have to maintain the rate. You can't increase the rate of runoff. The rate of runoff is measured in usually cubic feet per second. It's a flow. If that rate is met, it doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be a flooding impact downstream if there's an increase in the total volume of flow. Picture this, you have a bathtub with a clogged drain here, got in it, not mine, I guess, but somebody's, and the faucet's running, it fills up, and it's gonna overflow. If it runs for an extra 6 hours, there's a lot more overflow than if it only runs for 12 hours, if it runs for 18 hours. That extra volume is what causes the flooding downstream. If there's a restriction, the water builds up behind it and increases the flood level and increases the duration of the flood. I think that's an important issue that needs to be assessed through these offsite impacts, especially if you're also adding a whole bunch of groundwater flow to the same system that's already likely undersized. They didn't usually design storm drains for big storms, maybe a 10-year max. So I think that's something that should be part of that assessment, needs to be, brought into the mix. I had a bunch of comments on compliance with stormwater management regulations. I don't think there's much of a need to go into those in too much detail. I suspect that Mr. Reardon is well aware of the same things. I do want to make sure we meet the setbacks. Sometimes, the regs say greater than 10 feet for an infiltration system from a foundation, but it depends on also the depth of the foundation relative to the infiltration system. And there's more than, that one factor. The regulations say between 10 and 100, look to the specific type of structure proposed. Subsurface structures have sort of no guidance. So we have to use engineering judgment. You may have to do mounding analyses to see. It's not just 10 feet, carte blanche, we're done. You have to look at the specifics. If you have a system that's on the downhill side of a foundation and the water's going away from it, you can be closer than if you're on the uphill side of it. That's just common sense. So I think we need to look at that carefully to make sure what's being proposed isn't going to cause a problem, on or off site. I think those are sort of the main issues. Retaining wall is the same type of, you put it too close to a retaining wall, water's going to go through the wall. There's no design details or any information on any of these retaining walls. Some of them I think are about 10 or 12 feet high along, I think the east side. So usually if they're a modular block wall, they have reinforcing that comes back into the road. If it's a cast in place, that's a pretty significant thing. They have big footings. How does that work? All of those things I think need to be sort of brought into the mix before we get to the final end of the project here. In particular, where they're higher walls. A 2-foot wall on the low side probably isn't that big of an issue, but the taller one certainly could be. I think lastly, I should say that the open basin doesn't have any way to get to it to maintain it. you have to have access for equipment, not just somebody walking down there or lugging a weed whacker. You have to go in there. You might have to get in there with a machine. You might have to clean it out. That's pretty standard stuff. Usually equivalent of a backhoe being able to get down there to work on it. So that needs to be incorporated into the design. And I don't believe it has been, because you pretty much boxed in with a wall all the way around, unless you can get permission from somebody else. And there, I don't believe that the easement would give somebody a right to go through private property to maintain the basin.
Okay.
That's I'm trying to be brief, so that's.
Yeah, thank you. The issue of accessing that rear area has been raised a few different times in this hearing in a few different ways, and is, in my mind, an unresolved issue. So I appreciate that point. Mr. Hill? Thank you, Mr. Chessier.
Thank you. Scott, can you speak to the broader hydrology issues that you've summarized in your letter?
Yes, certainly, Mr. Chair. I did submit a letter, as you indicated earlier, and with your permission, I could show the tables and figures if I share my screen and walk through it that way. Alternatively, I could just reference them as I go. It's up to you. It might be more clear to show the figures, but again, I defer to you.
I have to say, there are so many details, engineering details. I don't, my personal opinion, I don't think that'll be helpful. I think the written material is extremely helpful. I'm appreciating the bigger point. Is it compliant? Is it not? What needs to be remedied? But I'll yield to the board members if they think that we should be showing the tables on the screen. Yeah, Mr. Horsley, please proceed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just walk through the letter, and I have only 4 points, so I won't take a lot of time. The first one really is I prepared a table using the applicant's data showing depth of groundwater across the site.
Yeah,
I think the data is important to understand in terms of how shallow it is. As I've indicated, there are a number of places where it's less than 2 feet. The average is 4 feet according to the test pits. And the reason why I think this is important is, as we'll get into the groundwater issues and the groundwater mounding, and as has already been testified, there's some pretty significant concern with respect to the garage construction, et cetera, because of the shallow groundwater. So I'll leave that comment just at that and refer you to that table that's in my letter. The second comment has to do with the amount of stormwater that the applicant plans to recharge. And this is relative to Mass DEP Stormwater Standard 3. I also prepared a table using the applicant's data that shows that depending on which infiltration system we're looking at, it ranges from roughly double to 4 times the amount of stormwater that's being proposed to put in the ground compared to existing conditions. Now, the Stormwater Standard 3, which I was involved in drafting, basically says that stormwater recharge and infiltration should equal pre-existing conditions. In other words, they should be matched. This proposal is to increase it by a factor of 2 to 4. We're putting a lot, so there's a lot more water going into the ground than existing conditions. And I, not to repeat, but as I said the last time, I think everybody would agree, I would hope, if you put more water into the ground, the water table is going to come up. There's really no way around that. If we're putting a lot more in on the order of 2 to 4 times, that's significant and that should be evaluated. And I don't believe it has been. So that's my comment on the amount of groundwater recharge rates. And again, I have a table in here with all the figures directly from the applicant's updated revised engineering report. The third comment has to do with what's called groundwater mounding. And groundwater mounding is what happens during a specific storm event, during the, say, the 10-year storm, the 25-year storm. And there's a requirement of the Mass DEP stormwater standards to do a groundwater mounding analysis. There's a couple different models that can be used. This applicant used one called the hand twitch method, which is one of the accepted methods. Like any model, they require inputs to estimate the amount of groundwater mounding, which means how much the water table will come up from a various storm. There's two of the most important inputs to that model are what's called saturated thickness, meaning how thick the groundwater is on the site, and the permeability. And as I pointed out in my letter, the applicant has used what I would consider a somewhat arbitrary value of 20-foot saturated thickness. If you look at their test pit data, and now I'm referring to table 3 in my report, the average saturated thickness on the site is 4.9 feet. roughly 1/4 of the value that they put in the model. I did rerun their model on one of the test bits just to illustrate this, and that is included in my report. And what that shows on that test bit, on that infiltration system, instead of a roughly 0.5 foot increase, about 6 inches, it goes up to 1.5 feet, about triple at that one basin. So my suggestion there would be, and again, I would submit that this is standard procedure. Inputting to a model, you use the most conservative actual measured data. They're assuming 20-foot thickness of groundwater. They've only measured 5 feet. So I believe the model should be run at the 5 feet unless they submit additional data that suggests that they have, in fact, 20 feet saturated thickness, which frankly, I don't think they do based upon the geology. And then my last point is one on water quality. We've heard a little bit of discussion on this. This is a relatively new set of laws. I actually have done training on this for U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. This is the Clean Water Act, so-called Phase 2 MS4 program. It does, as Mr. Hill pointed out, and I'm not trying to practice law here, Dan, that it does set a whole new set of standards that municipalities have to comply with. I agree with Mr. Reardon's comment that the permit is to the town, but one of the requirements of that permit is that the town regulate development such that it does not add, and I'll paraphrase the existing stormwater bylaw, any pollutants to these already impaired waters. And the two pollutants that these waters are impaired for currently are pathogens and nutrients. I believe that both are potential coming from this site. They have not been evaluated in terms of the level of loading from the project, but they are, in my view, would be not in compliance with this with the town bylaw, which says no addition of pollutants. The pollutants that these receiving waters are impaired for. I'll also point out that directly downstream of the project is Trout Brook, and that flows into another river, which is rated and certified as a cold water fishery. So another point that I believe is worth at least talking about and evaluating are thermal impacts. Thermal impacts come from clearing of trees. They create what we call microclimate. We probably all experience this. If you're in an open area where there's a lot of sun, it's warmer. So as you cut down trees and increase impervious surfaces, you have what's called microclimate thermal impacts. This site clearly is doing that. One of the low impact design principles is to maintain as much vegetated buffer as possible and to minimize impervious surfaces. I'm not sure that's been done here. So I will conclude there. There's more details in my letter, but I believe that's a fair summary, and I'll turn it back to Mr. Hill unless you have questions, Mr. Chair.
No, I don't have any questions. Mr. O'Brien or Ms. Joffer? Mr. O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've had a fair number of conversation over the last 2 days about federal water quality standards, MS4, the town's responsibility to oversee compliance with its bylaw. I'm getting the impression from some of this discussion that these are relatively new requirements. Is that correct?
That is correct.
How new?
Actually, I don't recall the exact dates. I believe they're in Mr. Hill's letter, but I'll say within the last couple of years. Although if I may just add to that, the town bylaw, I believe, is 2006. It does reference these regulations. The reason I said the last couple of years is because these laws were passed quite a while ago, perhaps 10 years ago at the federal level and the state level, but there were challenges to them. So a lot of the local compliance got put on hold during legal challenges. And again, I'll defer to Mr. Hill here, but I believe those were resolved in the last couple of years, and that permit is now in effect.
Thank you, Mr. Horsley. Mr. Chair, I have a question for Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, don't want to get Mr. Horsley in trouble for practicing law without a license, but could you care to comment what the status of the litigation, if there is any, or any decisions either from state or federal courts that may be of interest, or administrative bodies that may be of interest to the board on this issue?
Sure. So Scott's right that the MS4 program has been in existence for probably over a decade, and there's been a general permit issued by EPA to the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that covers all small municipal storm separate sewer systems. That's where MS4 comes from, the acronym. And so that general permit has been in existence for a long time. It was challenged 3 or 4 years ago by multiple groups, including nonprofits, CLF, a few municipalities. That case was settled. It was a federal court case that was settled, I believe, in 2020. And then the EPA and the DEP jointly adopted a modified general permit. That modified general permit was effective as of January 2020, I believe. And I was going to actually put on the screen in a few minutes one specific section of that deals with construction management planning that's now required of all municipalities as they look at projects just like this.
Is there any case law out there regarding projects such as that is being proposed here?
I'm not aware of case law. I haven't dug in that deep, so I'm not sure how it's been interpreted. Scott, are you aware of any case law?
I'm not.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Joffer, any questions?
No, not at this time. Thank you.
Mr. Hill?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I could just share my screen. Oh, I've been disabled. Could someone enable me?
Daniel, Michael, can we do the share screen, please? Shane?
Can you offer your testimony without sharing your screen, Mr. Hill?
I think I got it. Okay.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Mr. Mullin, the ability to give it.
Okay, so Mr. Chair, I wanted to just visually show what we're talking about in terms of the groundwater elevations vis-a-vis the parking garage, which is referenced by Mr. Chesia and Mr. Horsley. This graphic shows the groundwater elevation at 117 feet, which is the elevation that was found in test pit 8. This is overlaid on top of the architectural plan sheet A300, which is a cross-section of the site roughly in the southern part of the site, looking at the parking garage, and you can see the existing house here on the right. So as you can see, the groundwater is obviously higher than the bottom floor of the foundation, and that water is going to have to be moved. That we share the comment that was made that this needs to be studied, and there needs to be, Mr. Reardon asked for details on how this is going to be dewatered. This goes to, actually this slide shows, graphically shows the issue that Mr. Chester was raising, where you have drainage infiltration systems so close to retaining walls. And Mr. Chester noted in his letter that I think there's 3 systems, systems 1, 2, and 6, I believe, that are within the setbacks governed by the Mass DEP Stormwater Handbook. And Mr. Reardon referenced this, I believe, as well in his comments, that these need to be addressed. Another point that we wanted to make tonight, just briefly, is the end of the cul-de-sac at Meeting House Lane. So you've heard discussion about how there's going to be a direct connection now to the drainage system in Meeting House. We'd like to know specifically what impact that construction is going to have on the trees that are at the end of the cul-de-sac. So if you remember this slide from the applicant's presentation, they were promoting the fact that there's already some dense mature trees at the end of the cul-de-sac, which will act as a natural screen to the project. But that drainage pipe is roughly in this area here and would require, and this is the site plan that shows it being replaced existing 10-inch with a 12-inch pipe. So I guess we'd like some more information and details as to what exactly is going to be involved here. What's the limit of construction to replace this pipe, and how many trees that were shown in the previous slide are going to be lost when that pipe is replaced? We also share, of course, the concern that that the applicant has to prove that they even have these easement rights, and we're not we're not satisfied that they do, and we haven't found anything in the registry of deeds either that confirms that. And then with respect to the MS4 permit, which Mr. O'Brien just asked about, this is a section from the general permit which states that towns have to adopt bylaws and procedures for review of private projects. So Mr. Reardon's correct that the obligation is on the town to comply with the general permit, but part of that obligation is to oversee and regulate private projects. And this specific section requires there to be a site plan procedure to review, right here, the language is a pre-construction review by the permittee of the site design and the proposed operations during the construction phase. You know, one of the big issues that Mr. Chessier raised is obviously the site's constrained. There's not a lot of room to stockpile and store materials and trucks. But when you start digging the hole, excavating the hole for the foundation for the garage, there's going to be water there, and that water has to be pumped out. And where is that water going to be pumped to? These are important details that really should get flushed out, no pun intended, during this hearing and not post-permit. And that's where I disagree with Mr. Schomer. He suggested that this can't be reviewed during the public hearing. I think, first of all, I don't think that's correct even under 40B. But again, since this is now an MS4 project, I believe it certainly is appropriate for the zoning board to ask these questions and to do the review that's actually required under the Clean Water Act general permit. And again, that can't be trumped by Chapter 40B. So that concludes what I had to say, Mr. Chairman. And I do want to thank you for asking the applicant to provide the impact study and analysis. We definitely want to review that when it comes in, because I think we're all kind of skeptical that there's not going to be any negative impact downstream, where this project is proposing a new direct connection to what Mr. Burke says is an already undersized infrastructure. So how can you put a new direct connection into an already undersized infrastructure and not have a negative impact? That just intuitively doesn't make sense to us. So we look forward to seeing that come in, and then we would obviously like the opportunity, as I'm sure you are, to review that very, very closely.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hill. I agree. I mean, I think the board has made its position clear on the plan, and we'll wait to hear from Mr. Schomer on that. So thank you, Mr. Hill and Mr. Chessier and Mr. Horsley for your time and for your presentations, and Mr. Reardon as well. I mean, I think that concludes the board's business of the night. I wonder if there are people in the audience who wish to be heard. With my only caveat being, we're only going to take new matters tonight. I feel like we've heard a lot on water and drainage, and it continues to be a moving target. But I'm interested in taking questions to the extent that there are any. Ms. Sutton?
There is. We have the McGraths.
Yes, Ms. McGrath, Mr. McGrath. Welcome to
this is Michael McGrath.
Mr. McGrath.
Mr. Reardon, could you talk in further detail, and hopefully you've examined the outfall pipe that Mr. Burke had spoke about last week, and how an outfall pipe would be drained, whether it's dumped or it quietly moves into the stream that is owned by 176 Robin Street and 152 Robin Street, how an outfall pipe could be. Could you just please discuss or talk at length about the outfall pipe? Thank you.
Through the chair, Mr.
I'm
Reardon.
sorry, Mr. Mullen.
Mr. Reardon.
I'm not quite sure what the question is, but I'll tell you that as far as I'm assuming we're talking about drainage. What we apply is the principle that if we mitigate our pre versus post runoff number so that we are discharging water at the same or a lower peak rate, that there are no downstream impacts. So to the extent of our analysis is as long as we meet that standard and we're decreasing our peak rate of runoff for the required design storms, we feel that demonstrates that you're complying with the standard for pre versus post runoff and that you're not creating downstream impacts. So as far as chasing particular issues downstream, no, we don't typically do that. but we can certainly, in the interest of sort of creating a net benefit as a function of the project, we can certainly look at it.
You didn't answer my question. Mr. Burke talked about an outfall pipe that was going to drain into a private stream owned by 176 Robin Street and 152 Robin Street. This hasn't been discussed at all. It's all about Meeting House Lane.
No, so there's a portion of the site, of the existing site, which currently drains to that stream. The applicant has analyzed the volume of water currently going to that stream and is done a design that sends the same or less peak flow to that stream.
You believe that analysis?
Excuse me?
You've reviewed that analysis and it's the same flow into the private stream?
And I have reviewed the analysis and it's part of the comments that we've issued to Mr. Burke that we've asked him to address.
Thank you, Mr. Mullen.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Rose Gallagher.
Good evening, Mr. Chair. It's Paul Gallagher, and
Mr. Gallagher.
I'll just address because of what Mr. Burke said tonight, which has me completely baffled here. At the walkthrough, we all stood at the manhole on Meeting House at the end of my driveway. So I don't think there should be any doubt where my sewer connects. Does not connect to Alfred Road. It has never connected to Alfred Road. There is no U-turn. I don't know where he gets that information if he could not find any plans. It is a straight shot. It is the original connection to the sewer manhole that the town connected to when the house was built in 1972. When the sewer system was done in 2017, the contractor did file a plan with the town. He can certainly go to the town hall. He can go to the DPW, whoever has that record, and he can see that it is a straight line to that sewer. There is no U-turn. He also shouldn't have any doubt to the sewer it connects to, because when Mr. Berkeley told us all there is a problem in that sewer, it's prior to the MWRA easement. At that meeting, Mr. Burke told me, we're going to fix your problem. We're going to fix your problem. There should be no doubt where my sewer connection is. And also, as I appreciate you guys reading my letter, we know that a lot other sewage dumps into that manhole as well that was not revealed that particular day. So that's all I have to say. My sewer connection is a straight shot. There is no U-turn, and it connects to the Meeting House sewer.
Thank you, Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Schomer, this question goes back to the board's earlier comment about needing in one place the offsite infrastructure plan. It's pervasive in this hearing. It's raising far and away the vast majority of the comments. And we just need to know what the plans are. We need to know what the applicant is proposing to do. We need to know what the applicant has done, and we need to know what the results of that is. I know you know that, but I thought it was worthy of repeating, having heard from Mr. McGrath and Mr. Gallagher, who are all getting to know quite well because they've been forced to raise these issues time and again. So enough said.
Understood, Mr. Chair. That I consider that to be our first priority.
Thank you. Anybody else want to be heard tonight?
We just got another hand. Joanne.
So I just wanted to confirm what Mr. Hill said. So we lived here for 3 or 4 years. It's not long. However,
I'm sorry, Ms. Fu, is it Fu?
Yeah.
Could you tell us where you live? What's your address?
Yeah, so we live in 56 Meeting House Lane, which is the closest house to the project. So what happened is last winter, I think one house, another house, neighbor's house on Meeting House Lane wanted and added gas to their house. And then all of a sudden, our house, was out of gas. And so it's in the middle of the winter. We don't even have any, hot water, no heating for a whole day. I was calling National Grid and nobody, answers my phone. And then, then I hijacked somebody because it's working on that my neighbor's house, that adding the gas. I hijacked them and asked, hey, my house, in the middle of the winter has been out of heating and hot water for the whole day. And it's like my elderly parents and my kids. And so then they said, oh, this is like old infrastructure. This is old house, it happens, could happen this way. So I'm just bring up this point, like, I totally agree. So this is, I don't know, of course, now we're talking about water drainage. I'm just saying, this is definitely old infrastructure and add so much additional pressure onto it. Nobody knows what's going to happen. I just know like one neighbor, doing something. I'm just out of gas for the whole day. So I'm just want to share this point. So
that's helpful. We appreciate that. Thank you. For the record, 56 Meeting House Lane is
56 Meeting House Lane.
And that is the property, as if I understand it correctly, if the easement does exist, it is on that property.
No, we rejected that.
No, I understand. But is your house not the last house?
Well, that's coming.
Ms. Fu, is your house not the last house on the left at the very end of the street?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
Yeah, so exactly.
Okay.
That's the house.
Thank you very much. Is that all you wanted to share with us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that, I don't want to repeat my concerns again. I think, we already raised our concern in terms, the size of the building is huge. And, imagine, once that happened, it's going to be all the lights and the noises. It's like, just on top of a house, this kind of situation. It's unbearable.
Fair enough. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Yeah.
Anybody else wish to be heard, Beth?
There are not.
Mr. Chair, if I may, just before
Mr. Schomer.
Before Ms. Fu logs off or gets muted, we obviously, because she's the next door neighbor to this project, we have a lot to discuss with her. And while the hearing was proceeding, I did look up the property information and confirm that she and her husband are the owners of the property. So perhaps it would be possible for her to reach out to Mr. Zerwinski to put her in touch with me. But we do want to speak with her directly to discuss her concerns and to address this issue of the easement. So I would invite her to do that.
Yeah, I mean, board has no comment.
Understood.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Okay, let's talk about next Wednesday now. Mr. Reardon, are you going to have, well, I guess you don't know what you're going to have. Are we safe enough to schedule a hearing for next Wednesday to conclude the discussion on the drainage and stormwater issues and to hear from Mr. Reardon to be followed by a written report? Is that adequate or is that risky?
No, because I haven't even seen the information yet.
Okay.
So what I prefer to do is once the information gets submitted, I'll be happy to shoot Tim and Judy an email to let them know what my status is. But until I don't want to speculate based on when something's supposed to come in.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Ms. Barrett.
Yes.
Have you heard from the peer reviewer on architecture?
Not in the last couple of days. I will check in. He and I have to speak tomorrow about another matter, so I will speak to him. He actually has been trying to call me, but every time he calls, I'm in a Zoom meeting.
Is there the reason I ask that is the concluding the additional matters that the board needs to hear from is him, Mr. Reardon, and the town officials. I am schedule focused. We'll put it that way.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I don't want to call a hearing for next Wednesday so that we can meet and schedule a hearing for the following Wednesday.
Of
I'm
course.
wondering if it isn't more advisable to postpone, to not have a hearing next Wednesday and to schedule something to be heard on June 29th, June 9th, at which time we'll hear from the peer reviewer on urban design. We'll hear from Mr. Reardon. We'll hear from Mr. Burke to the extent that Mr. Burke has anything to add. And then on the 16th, we'll hear from the town officials.
I can certainly speak with Cliff Bulmer about that tomorrow. He's pretty responsive, so I can get back to you.
Mr. Schomer?
Yes, Mr. Chair, that sounds like a schedule that would be very reasonable. I can also report to the board that we had an informal conversation with Mr. Bomer last Friday. We had a working session scheduled with him on another project up in Belmont, and we took the opportunity while we were on the Zoom call to speak with him for a few minutes about this project. So I won't put words in his mouth, but my impression was that his view of the design was that it was, as he said previously, moving in the right direction. So I won't say more than that to put words in his mouth. But
Okay, so I want to hear from the board, but let me try this. Would it be possible to have the working session next Wednesday? Not as a board meeting, obviously, but see if we could schedule that, or is that too aggressive?
I guess what I'm asking is, do we know is Mr. Reardon going to have what he needs submitted by the applicant so that the working session makes sense?
Okay.
I mean, I guess that's it's hard to schedule these things when we're told something's going to be filed and then we don't have it. So I'm not averse to trying to schedule something on Wednesday, but I'm just telling you what my reservation is.
Let's do this. We don't need to schedule the working session in this meeting. What we need to do is make sure that the people who we've agreed to be at the working session are there. So what I'll propose for consideration by the members is the next, we'll recess this hearing to June 9th, at which point we'll hear from Mr. Reardon, Mr. Burke, and the peer reviewer for the urban design. That will be the subject. And then on the 16th, we'll hear from town officials.
Yeah.
Mr. O'Brien, Ms. Joffer. Yes, Ms. Sutton.
We have one more hand up. Amy McGrath.
Okay.
I think,
Okay.
Mr. Mullen, I'm sorry. I know this is a long process for you. Can we just go back to the easement for 1 second? And if maybe you can ask the developer. I think what I heard the neighbors say, and I'm sorry, I don't know them and I don't know their name, is that they've already been approached about this easement and they've rejected it. So I'm just confused from the site control discussion that we had earlier. I don't understand how the developer doesn't know whether or not they have an easement for this. I mean, I don't know people who buy a development site and don't know what easements they have for infrastructure. So it sounds to me like maybe they do in fact know that they need an easement. Maybe I misheard, but I know it's a very critical issue for site control. So I'm sorry to take up additional time.
Yeah, I don't know. Mr. Sherman, do you want to respond to that?
Through the chair, Ms. McGrath, the applicant has not approached Ms. Fu to my awareness with respect to a conversation about the easement. We very much intend to have that conversation with them. Our position is that we do have an easement. We are in the process of doing research to document that. And as I mentioned previously, if it is necessary to get a land court judgment to confirm our easement rights, we intend to do that prior to construction.
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
If there's going to be a serious discussion about the adequacy of site control documentation, we're going to need to contact someone at Mass Housing for them to comment on what they had or didn't have, as the case may be. Because part of their whole project eligibility process is to determine whether the applicant has site control. So if we're going down the path here of potentially questioning that, then I think,
We've already questioned it, yeah.
okay, so.
And I opened the comments about questioning exactly that and wondering, asking Mr. Schomer if he could document the circumstances under which they have site control in accordance with the requirements of 760, I'm sorry, 260 CMR 56.04 paren 4 paren G. My guess is that Mass Housing wasn't aware either of the significance of this matter and the significance that it would take on at the hearing, which was probably impossible to know at the time. I have no objection to contacting Mass Housing, but I did look at the application, and it didn't look to me like there had been documentation that the easement existed. I think this only came up, as I said at the top of the meeting, they only came up when the town raised it in an initial comment to be followed by Ms. McGrath's follow-up, and it just is an issue that hasn't been resolved. What I'm not prepared to do is let this hearing run to its conclusion without documenting the evidence of site control that's required as a preliminary characteristic for the application in the first place. So we definitely need to resolve this one way or the other. And I thought that by opening the hearing with this issue, we would be giving the applicant sufficient time to run it to ground while we considered the other matters. But it's a significant matter. As to whether or not the applicant has spoken to Ms. Fu, the owner of 56 Meeting House Lane, I mean, we heard the testimony. We'll take the applicant at its word. That's a private matter that I think is outside of the scope of the board. If to the extent the applicant wants to have conversations with private property owners, that's their business. But we are going to hear from the applicant on how they've documented site control, and to the extent that Mass Housing has information that can help us to reach a conclusion that there is site control.
陈伟，快点！我现在有好重要的事情，你这个人不来听，他们好像说他们已经有意思。
Maybe Ms. Fu could be mute. Yeah, thank you. That's fine. You know, I want to hear from them. So Judy, if you want to do that, that's fine. I'm not sure it's required. The applicant can do that, or we can look at the application itself. I mean, I did look at it. The evidence of site control was the deed to the property they own in fee, but the reg's pretty clear. You need the easements as well. So
I understand. They just have a very specific regulatory role in the determination of site control. So
I'd love to hear from them. Happy, and then would invite them to.
Okay.
Ms. Fu's hand is up.
Yes, Ms. Fu. You're on mute right now.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I think, we were talking about the easement. I think probably we are talking about the different easement here. If you wanted to discuss in more details.
I actually don't. I don't want to discuss negotiations between private property owners at the hearing. What we want is the applicant to document to the board's satisfaction that they've got site control as required by the Commonwealth's law. That's what we want. So if the applicant wants to get together with you and talk about that and reach an agreement, that's fine. But I really don't want to talk about negotiations between private property owners and the applicant. I just don't feel like that's appropriate.
Okay.
All right. But I'd invite the property owners to speak with the applicant. I'd invite the applicant to speak to the property owners and come back to the board and answer the questions we've asked.
Understood on our end, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Any other, I don't know if we were in the Q&A. I think we were talking about scheduling. Let me say what we're looking at is recessing this hearing to June 9 for what feels like a redo of tonight, frankly, with final information and additional peer review from a peer reviewer on urban design, and on the 16th to be heard from town officials. And I'll rely on Mr. Zawinski to check with the town officials that we need to see if they can be here on the 16th, and he can let us know on the 9th. And in the meantime, Ms. Barrett, we'll see if she can convene an appropriate working session with the representatives that we talked about tonight. Do the members have comments on that proposed schedule?
I probably missed this. I'm just unclear as to why we're skipping next week.
There's not going to be enough information to have a robust enough conversation, and we can't confirm that the peer reviewer for the design is available.
Okay. Okay.
You know,
Thanks.
that
I'm just
work for you?
conscious of the 6-week extension. So
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, but I want to feel like we try to fill the time rather than maximizing the time, and I want to urge Mr. Burke to complete his work, to get that to Mr. Reardon so that he can complete his work, so that we can complete our work. And that's my sense of what's going on here, you know. And in the meantime, Judy's going to check in with Cliff, Mr. Bomer, and make sure he's available. But not knowing that he is available, I don't want to schedule a hearing. We're going to postpone it next Wednesday, you know.
okay. Thank you, Mr.
Does that
Chair.
work for people?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Schomer,
Nothing further from us. It works. That schedule works. Thank you.
Mr. Hill.
That works for us. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to recess this here. Now, with no further business before the board, we'll recess the 17th session of the hearing, and we'll pick this up on June 9th at the 18th session, as discussed, to be followed by another hearing on the 16th. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. You as well.
Bye now.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Everybody.